The fluorescent lights inside the Barrie Municipal Impound Facility hummed the way they always do in places that aren't meant for people. Steady, indifferent, a little too bright. The kind of light that makes everyone look tired and guilty at the same time. Sergeant Wade Kowalski had been running intake at the facility for 11 years. He'd seen everything that comes through those doors. Grieving owners, angry owners, people who pretended they'd never seen the animal in question before in their lives. He thought he'd stopped being surprised a long time ago. Then Neva Drummond walked in. She was maybe 24, 25. Small build, dark hair pulled back in a braid that had mostly come undone. She wore a canvas jacket 2 sizes too big, the kind of jacket that belongs to someone else, or used to. She carried a manila envelope tucked under one arm, and she walked with the deliberate, careful step of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times before, and was terrified it wouldn't go the way she'd planned. She asked for Sergeant Kowalski by name. He came out from behind the desk, and she introduced herself quietly, without any of the nervousness he'd expected. She said she was there about the dog in Kennel 14, the one they'd flagged for behavioral assessment, the one the memo on his desk that morning had already designated for euthanasia. Pending review, which in his experience meant pending nothing, because nobody was coming to review a 9-year-old Belgian Malinois with a biting incident on his record and no placement options left. Kowalski looked at the envelope under her arm. She said, "He was my father's dog." Constable Raymond Drummond had served with the RCMP for 18 years, the last 7 of them as a dog handler out of the Collingwood detachment. He and his partner, a Belgian Malinois named Rook, had worked narcotics interdiction, missing persons, one particularly grim homicide investigation in the fall of 2021 that nobody in the detachment talked about anymore. They were a unit the way only handler and dog can be, not owner and pet, not officer and tool, but 2 animals who had figured out how to trust each other completely and had built a life around that trust. Raymond Drummond died in March, 14 months ago. A highway call, black ice, a transport that crossed the center line. He was pronounced at the scene. He was 51 years old. He had a daughter, Neva, who was 23 at the time and living in Toronto, finishing her 2nd year of a social work degree. He had no spouse. He had a sister in Sudbury who sent flowers, and he had Rook. The RCMP's policy on retired or active service dogs when a handler dies is not cruel, exactly. It is just a policy, which means it was written for the average case, not the human one. Rook was assessed. Rook was rehomed temporarily with another handler who had the capacity. Then that handler transferred to Kelowna, and Rook, who did not travel well and did not accept new commands easily, ended up surrendered to a municipal shelter in Barrie when the interim arrangement fell apart. He was there for 6 weeks before Neva found out. She found out the way families find out things they weren't supposed to know. Through someone who felt guilty enough to say something. A constable who had known her father, who had seen the intake paperwork cross her desk and held onto Neva's number for 2 weeks before she finally called. She called on a Thursday night. Neva was on the subway home from a placement shift, and she stood in the aisle with her hand around the pole and her eyes burning and did not say much. She said thank you. She said she would figure it out. She had 4 days before the review. She drove up from Toronto on a Saturday morning, which meant leaving at 5:30 to miss the traffic and arriving in Barrie just after 7, when the facility didn't open until 8. She sat in the parking lot and ate a granola bar she didn't taste and went over the documents in the envelope one more time. She had his service records, what she could get. A letter from his detachment commander, Staff Sergeant Pauline Orvette, who had written 3 careful paragraphs about Raymond Drummond's service and 1 very precise sentence about Rook. This animal served as Constable Drummond's partner for 7 years and demonstrated exceptional capability, loyalty, and temperament in active service. She had a copy of the original handler agreement. She had a photograph, her father and Rook, at a commendation ceremony in 2020, both of them squinting slightly in the afternoon sun, her father's hand resting on the dog's back with the casual ease of a man who has forgotten he is being photographed because the dog is right there, and that's enough. She had also printed out the provincial guidelines on the adoption of retired police service dogs, which technically gave priority placement to former handlers and their immediate families, and which the Barrie facility had apparently not been provided because no one had thought to send them. She put the documents back in order. She put the envelope on the passenger seat. She thought about her father's hands. He had big hands, wide across the knuckles, and he used them when he talked. Not wildly, but with emphasis, tapping the table to make a point, curling his fingers when he was thinking. She thought about how those hands looked in the photograph, easy on Rook's back. She thought about what it meant that somewhere in that building, the dog who had known those hands better than anyone was alone in a kennel and did not understand why. She got out of the car. Sergeant Kowalski listened. To his credit, he listened carefully. He read the letter from Staff Sergeant Orvette. He looked at the handler agreement. He looked at the provincial guidelines, which Neva had highlighted in 2 places. Then he sat back and said what bureaucracies always say, which is that this was more complicated than it appeared, and that the decision had already been escalated, and that there were liability concerns with the placement of a dog with a documented biting incident, and that his hands were, in several meaningful ways, tied. Neva said, "Can I see him?" Kowalski looked at her. "Before anything else," she said, "but before any of the decisions. Can I see him?" He said that wasn't standard procedure. She said she understood that. She said she wasn't asking for a procedure. She said she was asking for 5 minutes with an animal that had spent the last year and a half being bounced between facilities since her father died, and that she thought, with respect, that 5 minutes was not an unreasonable thing to ask. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. He said he'd have to stay in the room. She said that was fine. The kennels ran along both sides of a concrete corridor, and the sound hit before anything else, barking and movement, and the ambient distress of animals in enclosed spaces, which is a particular kind of noise that sits somewhere below language and above silence, and which Neva had not prepared herself for as much as she'd thought. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She kept her pace even. Rook was in Kennel 14 at the far end of the left row. He was not what she expected, and he was exactly what she expected. She had seen pictures, but pictures don't carry weight. He was big, bigger than she remembered from the commendation photo, though he'd been sitting then and she was seeing him standing now, pressed against the far wall of the kennel, his head low, his eyes tracking her from the moment she entered the corridor. There was a red notice on the door of his kennel. His muzzle was on. His coat was dull in a way that spoke of stress and too many strange hands, and he held himself with the coiled stillness of an animal that has learned not to move until it knows what's happening. He didn't bark. Every other dog in that corridor was barking. Rook watched. Neva stopped in front of the kennel door. Kowalski was behind her, a professional distance, giving her the 5 minutes he'd agreed to. She crouched down so she was at eye level with the dog. She put her hands on her knees. She didn't reach toward the wire. She just looked at him, and he looked at her, and for a long moment nothing happened. Then she said, quietly, not performing it, not projecting it, just saying it the way you'd say anything true, "Rook, ici." Here, her father had trained him in French commands. She knew this because her father had told her once, laughing about it, saying the RCMP used French and English both, and Rook had decided he preferred French, which was probably because Neva Drummond had grown up in Hearst, Ontario, where you spoke French first and English when you had to. She had looked up the commands the week before. She had sat in her apartment and spoken them aloud, feeling foolish, feeling necessary. Rook's head came up. It was small, barely a movement. His ears shifted. His weight changed, subtly, from the back legs to the front, like something had been rebalanced inside him. Neva stayed where she was. She didn't push it. She said his name again, just his name. And then she said her father's name, Raymond, the way you say the name of someone who is gone, careful and full, giving it all its syllables. She said it once. Rook walked to the kennel door. He moved without urgency, without the frantic energy of a dog performing distress or aggression. He walked to the door the way a dog walks toward someone they have decided to trust, which is one of the most specific and devastating things an animal can do, because they don't do it lightly and they don't do it wrong. He sat down in front of the wire. He looked at her. Behind Neva, Sergeant Kowalski had not moved. She did not turn around to look at him. She would find out later from the intake coordinator that in 11 years of running that facility, he had never once been seen to look away from a situation in the kennels. That morning, he looked at the floor. What happened next took 3 hours and involved 2 phone calls. One to Staff Sergeant Orvet, who answered on the first ring and spoke for 8 minutes, and one to the facility's supervising veterinarian, Dr. Anjali Sethi, who reviewed the biting incident report and noted, in writing, that the incident had occurred during Rook's 2nd week at the facility, when an unfamiliar handler had attempted to remove him from his kennel using a method that would have alarmed most dogs and had specifically alarmed this one, and that subsequent assessments had shown no repetition of the behavior. Dr. Sethi wrote, "Temperament consistent with handler-bonded working animal experiencing grief response" in her assessment notes and signed her name under it. It was not fast. It was not easy. Neva sat in the waiting room on a plastic chair and drank a coffee from the machine that was not coffee so much as the memory of coffee. And she waited. She had the photo from the envelope in her hands. Her father and Rook, the commendation ceremony, the easy hand on the dog's back. She thought about the last time she'd seen her father in person, which was Christmas 2 years ago. He'd driven down to Toronto, which he hated, the traffic and the density of it, people walking too fast in all directions, and they'd eaten takeout in her apartment because she didn't have a kitchen table yet, just a folding one she kept in the closet for occasions. He'd sat on her couch and talked about Rook for 40 minutes. He talked about a search and rescue call they'd done in November, a missing child in the Creemore area who'd been found in a drainage culvert, cold but alive, because Rook had turned off the marked trail and wouldn't come back when called, which was how they'd found the child. He talked about this with the particular kind of pride that isn't pride in yourself, but pride in something else, something you've been close to. She had half listened at the time. She'd been tired from the semester. She thought about that now, the specific quality of half listening. She put the photograph back in the envelope and waited. At 10:47, Sergeant Kowalski came out of the back office and found her in the waiting room and told her that the facility would be releasing Rook to her custody, conditional on a 2-week follow-up assessment with a certified animal behaviorist and registration transfer to her address. He gave her a form. He gave her a second form. He started to explain the forms and then stopped, because she was looking at him with an expression that had nothing of triumph in it, just something quiet and very tired, the face of someone who has been bracing for a long time and is slowly, carefully setting the weight down. She said, "Thank you." He said it was the right call. She said, "It was." He didn't take offense at that. Dr. Sethi removed the muzzle herself in the assessment room, with Neva present and Kowalski at the door. She spoke to Rook in a low, even voice throughout, narrating what she was doing and why, not for the dog's benefit, not exactly, but in the way that professionals sometimes narrate difficult things aloud, because the narration itself is a form of care. When the muzzle came off, Rook shook his head once. He sat very still for a moment. Then he turned toward Neva and pressed the top of his head against her knee. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not the leap and reunion of movies. It was just a dog finding the closest available person and asking, very quietly, in the only language he had, to be near them. Neva put her hand on his head. She kept it there. Dr. Sethi wrote something on her clipboard. Kowalski looked at the wall. Nobody said anything for a while because nobody needed to. The drive back to Toronto took 2 hours. Rook rode in the back seat. He was too big for it, really. His head kept coming over the center console, and she had to make him move it twice when she needed to check her mirror. The third time she just left him. She drove down the 400 with a Belgian Malinois. Breathing on her shoulder, and the windows cracked, and the grey Ontario afternoon coming in around the edges. She put on the radio without thinking. An oldies station, which is what her father always had on. He'd had strong opinions about classic rock and no patience for anything recorded after 1994, a position Neva had argued with for most of her adolescence. She didn't change it. She thought about calling her aunt in Sudbury. She thought about calling her friend Petra. Not on the list, her own friend, someone from her cohort at school who had been there through the worst of the first 6 months after her father died and had said the right things and mostly just shown up, which is all anyone can do. She thought about calling someone and then didn't call anyone. She just drove. At some point, somewhere around Cookstown, Rook settled. He stopped holding himself tense against the movement of the car and simply lay down, his head on his paws, his eyes occasionally drifting to the window and then back to Neva and then closing again. He sighed once, a long, unguarded exhale, and didn't wake up until she pulled into the parking garage under her building in the junction. She sat in the parked car for a minute. She looked at him in the rearview mirror. She thought about her father saying he prefers French. I don't know why, he just always came faster to the French commands, and she said very quietly, "Rook, rest." "Stay." He opened one eye. He didn't move. He was already staying. The follow-up assessment was 2 weeks later, with a behaviorist named Céline Brûlé, who worked out of a practice in Etobicoke and had 30 years of experience with working dogs and their transitions to civilian life. She spent 90 minutes with Rook and took careful notes and asked Neva questions about his feeding schedule, his sleep, his response to new people, whether he'd shown any alerting behavior, and if so, to what. She said he was grieving, which Neva had known. She said he was also adapting, which was harder to know from the inside. She said something else at the end, that Neva kept coming back to in the weeks that followed. She said that handler-bonded working dogs, the ones who've spent years reading a single person, anticipating their movements, building their entire sense of safety and purpose around one relationship, don't stop doing that job when the relationship ends. They just go looking for where to put it. They go looking for the nearest version of the thing they know. She said she'd seen Rook sit at the window twice during the session and look toward the door, not alerting, not anxious, just watching. Neva said, "Watching for what?" Céline Brûlé said, "I think he's decided that's your job now." There is a park 3 blocks from Neva's apartment where the trail runs along the Humber River for about 2 kilometers before it opens into a wider green space and then folds back on itself through a stand of old maples. She walks it every morning now, before work, in all weather, including the particular grey Ontario cold that starts in October and doesn't really end until April, and which she'd spent her whole life complaining about. She doesn't complain about it anymore. It requires being outside. Rook walks beside her, off-leash, on the quiet stretches, because he stays close, and because he knows Isi, and because she has learned, in the months since Barrie, to trust him the way her father taught her without ever meaning to, by example, by proximity, by the specific confidence of a person who has spent their life working with animals, and has passed that confidence on, even to a daughter who was too busy to always listen. She does not have her father's hands. She has her mother's hands, narrow and quick, better suited to paperwork than to the broad gestures her father used. But she has found herself using them differently, talking with them more, tapping the table. She doesn't know if Rook notices this. She suspects he does, in the way dogs notice everything they've decided to pay attention to, which, when it comes to their people is most things. She knows that he still sometimes stops at the front door of the apartment and waits there for a moment longer than makes sense before following her out. She knows that on the nights she stays up too late working on placement reports, he positions himself somewhere in her sight line, settling but not sleeping, keeping the watch. She knows he is not confused about who she is. She knows he is not waiting for someone else, but she knows, too, she's made her peace with knowing that some loyalties are large enough to hold more than one person, that what her father built with this dog over 7 years of cold mornings and highway calls and one terrible November in the Creemore drainage culvert did not end in March. It expanded. It came looking for somewhere to go. She found out about it in a parking lot in Barrie on a Saturday morning. She drove home with the radio on. She is still figuring out the rest. But every morning the trail runs along the river. And every morning Rook is beside her, and the maples are coming back now. It's late April. The buds are there if you know where to look, and there is a specific quality to the light at 7 in the morning in Ontario in spring that her father used to talk about, that grey lifting into gold, the world deciding to try again. She notices it now. She is paying attention.